Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. I'm your host, Drew, and today I want to get serious with you and have some fun at the same time. We are going to talk about time travel in the world of sci-fi. Stick around, you don't want to miss it.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Hey there, everyone, and welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. I'm excited about this show today. I'm excited to get into the nitty-gritty about time travel. Now, first of all, I want to let you know this is going to be a Back to the Future free podcast, so you're going to have to dig a little deeper and put aside your love for Marty and Doc and the gang, and we're going to get into some. There is a classic time travel flick we are going to talk about, time travel series for that matter. We're going to get into that a little bit later. I want to start off the show with a little bit of a weird one, and this is the time travel that takes place of the mind traveling through time. We've seen it a couple of times. Most notably, an entire film based on that is The Butterfly Effect. I think they made another Butterfly Effect that I never actually took part of. But the first one with Kelso, Ashton Kutcher, that one was about traveling through time, the consciousness traveling through time. Pretty interesting. Also, the same could be said for 13 going on 30. And I know you might laugh. I'm laughing too. But that is a time travel movie. So even though it's a rom-com of the strictest generic proportions, and because it's magic, there's still time travel involved, because this isn't like Big. In Big, Tom Hanks wishes to be big, and then he wakes up the next day in the same place, in the same house, just in the body of a 30-year-old man. In 13 going on 30, Jennifer Garner makes the wish to be 30 and flirty and thriving, and then her 13-year-old mind back in the 80s is transported into the future in her 30-year-old body. And of course, it's what's cell phones, what's all this? And being a typical 80s 13-year-old. Still a time travel movie. And most notably, as you Game of Thrones fans would happen to notice, they've done a little bit of that also in Game of Thrones. And in fact, that entire episode, the Hold the Door episode that has gotten everybody in tears about what happened to your lovable friend Hodor and what made him. And it not only does a transporting of the mind, which makes me completely question everything I thought I knew about warging, which really wasn't that much to begin with, but it added a whole nother dimension where time is cyclical. And I don't know if they're going to play this out any further in the show with the idea that you can affect the past from the present in such a way, because you thought he was just omnisciently visiting, just sort of seeing a memory rather than affecting the physical space. Because in previous episodes, Brandon had gone back and no one interacted with him. It was like he was almost like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, where he's just kind of looking at that point of view, but from the outside in. And then this one episode tears down every single one of those walls where the White Walker can see him, the White Walker touches him, and effectively screws everybody that's living in the cave. And then he wargs into Hodor in the present, which ends up affecting him in the past, which is, again, everything I thought I knew about what his gift was now in question. And I think that happened with a lot of people. I'm pretty sure they're not actually focusing on that aspect of it more than just, this is insanely, heroically and poetically tragic of what's happening to this character, not only at the present tense with what he was having to do, but how it affected him in the past. Like it was this twofold mind bender that was so beautifully done. And I don't know if Game of Thrones is really going to get into the time travel warging aspect of it again. We'll see. Obviously, there's not much that the books can go off anymore now that the show is caught up and really moving ahead on it. But that aspect of the time travel, so what we see in a show like Game of Thrones now, I guess, but mostly in something like the butterfly effect, where a present conscious mind can travel or inhabit the body of a previous one. In the butterfly effect, he only goes to the past and attempts to manipulate the present tense a lot in that film to get ahead. But one thing that it also talks about, and this is something that we're going to get into in the next segment of the show as we go into 11/22/63, is the idea of regret and lessons being learned through viewing how the present is when you went and decide to mess with the past. And it's not always, everybody talks about the doomsday scenario that comes about with the butterfly effect and how it affects the present. It's normally done and presented in some innocuous way, like don't go back in time and step on a bug because it can end up causing catastrophic effects in the future. That's been played out. It's completely impersonal, and therefore nobody really cares. It's from those personal things. It's a thing like the butterfly effect, where you see what the present is like. You see what happens, and can we pinpoint this thing in the past that made it so? And you always go back with good intentions. It's always the good intentions. And of course, we all know what the road to hell is paved with. But they go back in time to try to do something that they think is going to have a positive outcome. They're not trying to screw things up. They just think somehow in this life, there's got to be this one pivotal crux moment that if that would have been done differently, then it was all going to be smooth sailing from there. And in those films, it is inextricably always wrong. They always go back, do something that they think is going to be good, and it ends up screwing stuff up in the present tense. Which, that's what you're supposed to get out of this type of movie. Even if it's 13 going on 30 and you're having to try to believe that Mark Ruffalo at that point is 30 years old. When you look at these movies, it's not just the value of the excitement or the fictional aspect or even the science aspect of it. It is, what is it we're trying to tell you about you? And in the mind time travel film, because you get your present day brain in order to travel through time and to possibly fix those mistakes that you might view them as mistakes. You might view those particular moments in time as being something that if it were changed, it only would have been for the better. And that's what regret causes you to do. And these films allow you to process your regret and process your guilt and show you that, no, it really can always be worse. You may think that if you would have done this differently, if you would have stayed with this person, if you would have gone this way instead of that way, if you would have said this instead of that your life would have been much better than you could possibly imagine. Well, no, you never know. You can never go back far enough. You can never try to hinge it on that moment 10 years ago or 20 years ago when you were in high school and did something that you think completely screwed up your life. If you went back 20 years in time right now and tried to fix something, you have no idea what turn of events would have happened between 20 years ago and now. You can barely even answer for that if you would have done something differently yesterday. You don't know what it would be like. And the best thing about this is that it tells you no, it's really going to suck. If you went back and you did this and everything turned out to be better in the future, there's no point in that movie because it's just going to make you believe in the guilt and believe in the regret long enough. They want to make it a cautionary tale. It's a Grimm's fairy tale as it can possibly get. Don't meddle with going back in time to fix something. It's not going to make anything better. You have to make things better now. You can look at those events. You can have that regret. It has to be a teaching moment. You can't try to eliminate the moment and never have that be teaching you anything. If you don't get to live those moments, you don't get to live better because of it. You don't get to learn. You just try to cut those things out because they're hard to look at from the future. I get it. I have those moments. I have those regrets, but they're learning moments from me. I look back at those particular times like, oh man, I wish I could have done that differently, but I can't go back in the past and change that. The fact is, those things exist. There's nothing you can do about it. And to be honest, if you tried to go back and do something about it, you could end up worse off. All right, you're listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. We will be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we are back. We are talking about time travel, folks. It gets me revved. Gets me revved. Okay, yeah. Talking about time travel, it's important to me. And it's not just because of the aspect of wouldn't this be cool in the future? The science part of it, I'm not particularly focused on at this point. We want to talk about how the science fiction is affecting our lives and affects the way you look at things. The next one I want to roll on to and take a look at is another travel to the past, trying to fix something, and this one throws in a little bit of a different twist on it. It's called 11/22/63, which is the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That's what it's called, is 11/22/63, starring James Franco. It's a Hulu original miniseries based off a Stephen King book of the same title. Okay, now the premise of this show, or the premise of the miniseries, is present day in Maine, of course, because Stephen King's from Maine. There is a diner that Chris Cooper runs, and he's friends with Franco's character. Okay. And he has discovered a temporal flux, as you would say, in the diner that allows him to travel back in time to a specific date in 1961. Not 1963, a specific date. I think it's like in October of 1961. And it's just to that day. That's it. He goes back to the same day every time. So Chris Cooper launches his own crusade that we end up kind of learning about as the series kicks off. And he starts dying of cancer. And he wants Franco, he teaches adult education. He's a writer, I guess, to some degree. Definitely not a guy that's the type of person that will be taking this on. Of course, that's the hero's journey, is the person you don't expect that takes on these circumstances. So he says you got to go back in time and you have to stop JFK from being assassinated, which is a tall order. This isn't like other films that you see where you got to go back in time and I want you to tell your mother this. They don't keep it personal. They launch into something which is a massive undertaking, which is always talked about. In the conversations you have about time travel, like, oh, what would you do if you can go back in time? Well, more than likely, everybody says, oh, I'd go back in time and I'd kill Hitler, or I'd go stop the JFK assassination, stuff like this. And that's partly what makes, and I swear I wasn't getting into this, but by comparison, the premise of something like Back to the Future was the guy was like, I just want to go back and see, wouldn't it be cool if I go back in time and see what my parents like were in high school? That was that. It was not about getting on a scale of attempting to go back and change something that was you consider cataclysmic. And Chris Cooper does. He promotes the stakes of this because obviously Franco's character was not alive for Nam or, Lyndon Johnson or Carter. May have been born when Carter or Ford were around, but it wasn't his president. He just knows the legend of JFK, and that's what Cooper feeds him as being so important and making sure that this guy stays alive because he was going to get America on track. So here you see the bright-eyed optimism of Cooper and him qualifying such importance of a guy as to reflect on the present tense. So Franco has to go back in time. Again, it's 1961. So he then has to live in the 60s for about 2 years as he prepares to go try and stop the Kennedy assassination. And that's really the most I want to get into. So that's the setup for this. And I think it's an 8-part miniseries. It does wrap up a bit nicely. It doesn't go as far into the consequences and what he does to deal with it. Spoiler alert, he does end up saving JFK. But I mean, it's a process of getting there. But I just want to tell you, so he goes back to the present, and it's not good. And I'm not getting into what's not good, but it's the idea of, no, I stopped something that was so incredibly important. This guy was so incredibly important. And now things have to be better, right? It's good, right? No, it's not good. Because you can't go back that far. You cannot go back 40 plus years. I mean, if we were going to say it was 2016 and he's got to go back to 1963, I mean, that's 50 years ago. You think you go back 50 years and change something, even if it is something as important as the Kennedy assassination, that you can possibly account for the steps of mankind for the following 50 years and think it's going to be better? And I know, we don't talk about legacy. I mean, obviously, if you remove certain pivotal figures from time, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or Leonardo da Vinci, if you took these people out, would it be better? Would it be worse? You can talk about the impact that they have, but you can only do that in retrospect. You can only take a look at what they were worth and what value they brought and what legacy they have because they existed for that amount of time. You cannot account for something else happening for that amount of time. For 50 years, there's no way. Like I said in the previous segment, you can't even account for what would happen to you today if you just went back to yesterday and did something different. You could be dead at that point. You never know. But the one thing that this film, or the miniseries, that 11/22/63 does is that it introduces a fairly kind of religious aspect to it, where if you go back in time to try to change it, time pushes back on you. Time attempts to do things to keep you from doing what has already been done. So it introduces the idea that there is predestiny, that there is fate, that the book has already been written, and now you are trying to take what has been printed and has been sold, go back, cross some parts out, and put in your own ending. So it personifies or gives a bit of a religious, godlike context to time, that it actually has an opinion, that it actually has some kind of circumstance which it's going to act on. which is something that I had never seen in any other type of TV series or film where they deal in time travel. The idea, if you just go back and you change something, yeah, it can affect the future. But if you go back in time and time puts things in place to try to stop you, it's crazy. And in this miniseries, it happens all over. They bring in people. They cause delusions to take place. They'll inflict car accidents. It'll throw in a bunch of roadblocks simply to say, no, we are trying to make sure that this happens the way it had been done. So it really sets you up for the idea that there is something greater at play. There is something omnipresent, something powerful, a force of nature, and in this case, a force of time, which, again, I had never seen before. It's a very interesting take. Now, obviously, it ramps up. It gets a little bit more on the edge of your seat as it gets closer to the day. Obviously, he's in Dallas, and he's trying to make the moves to stop Oswald, and they keep throwing more and more things at. And throughout the series, they progressively throw in one or two things to let you know that, hey, this is what's going on. But it keeps throwing in those obstacles, not through a force of the time that's acting against it, but time itself. Incredibly, it's a fun board. I mean, it's Stephen King, so there are a lot of aspects. They get into some stuff that takes you a little bit off track of what the plot, as far as the Saving JFK plot goes, you know, sort of the side plots that you need to sustain a miniseries, that get standard, you know, misery-like creepiness that ends up coming about. Of course, there's a love story as well. And, you know, well, how's this going to work? You know, she's 50 years in the past and yada, yada, yada. They touch on a few other things, obviously, regarding civil rights and stuff that's going on at the time. It's an interesting series. It's one to watch, not just for the aspect of the time travel, but Stephen King did a lot of research about the decade in and of itself, a lot about John F. Kennedy in itself, a lot about the investigation into who Lee Harvey Oswald. It's more of an insight on who Lee Harvey is more than anything else. So definitely check it out. Again, that's on Hulu. Something pretty interesting for you to take home, and it's about 8 episodes. All right, you are listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. We got more on the way. We'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, everyone, we are back talking about time travel, and I want to go into one of my favorite time travel series, the Terminator. The Terminator series, one of the best. They put out, 5 films. They got a show. Definitely done a lot with that franchise to really put it on the map as far as not only the best of science fiction and general science fiction action, but also time travel itself. Now, the birth of that franchise is a pretty cool one. You may know James Cameron as of his most recent efforts with stuff like Avatar and Titanic, and really, you know, True Lies was one of my personal favorites. And then Terminator. Terminator put him on the map. Before that, he was trying to break into the horror game. Him and his buddies wanted that Romero, Wes Craven-like status of making the next big horror film. So the Terminator was born out of a nightmare that he had about seeing a robot walk out of the fire. That started him in the process of writing the script, which eventually, and if you think about it, the Terminator itself is a concept of that character, a killing machine, you know, that's great for a horror movie. It's good. But then it evolves. The story evolves into being a cool science fiction time travel action thriller that has some horror elements to it. I mean, yeah, it's a violent movie. It's got some gore in it a little bit, but ultimately it is one of those that's it's in the pantheon of science fiction. It's not considered a horror film, and for good cause. So the cool thing about it, you can sit there and watch the one from '84. It's still fun and enjoyable. I just watched it like 2 weeks ago. I watched that and T2. They still stand up. And even at the part, where he's in the hotel and cutting out his eye and all that crap, and you can tell that it's an animatronic, it's still fun. I'm just thinking like, yeah, it's 84. I'm not going to pass any judgment on that, but it still looks good. And T2 still holds up for the effects that it has. Really, the introduction of CG, they were smart to do T1000 the way they did it. It's buyable. It's liquid metal, therefore the CG of it's not complicated. Cool, look at these little effects that we can do with the computer, and they made it very, very simple. Now I want to get into a little bit about that one with T1000, because that one bothers me. The T1000 bothers me. In the first movie, when they're interrogating Kyle, he says that the time portal only works one way, which is cool. I like that they set that up. It raises the stakes. He knows he can't go home. But he says, when the guy asks him, well, why don't you just bring back some future weapons and stuff and get this done? Like, where's the ray guns and stuff like that? And he says, no, only living tissue can go through. So the Terminator is covered in living tissue. That's how he's able to go back, but he's buck naked, and so they can't bring future weapons into it. I like how they established that rule just so we don't have a bunch of other crazy things happening. You got to use modern technology. I like that. So they established that, which then again, I also kind of think like, well, why don't you just cover a ray gun with some skin and then just like cut it? That'd be so weird. But anyway, so these are the rules. But what about T1000? What I am assuming the liquid metal has to be covered with some type of biological material in order for him to travel back in time, right? So when he turns metal, or his knife turns into a hand, or he shapeshifts, is it manipulating the genetic material too? When he turns into just the full-on metal thing that you see, does the genetic material, does it go inside of him? Like, what happens to the biological stuff that was supposed to enable these people to time travel on T1000? Where does it go? I just want to know. Let me know. We're going to put this up. I'm going to share this on Facebook. I want to see some theories. I want to see some hypotheses about how T1000 works, travel back in time, because he shows up naked. So I would assume, for the sake of continuity, other than just people being naked, that he has to have that biological material. So please tell me, where does it go? Where does it go? All right. But going on further with the series, the robots make their own undoing, and that's what I enjoy about this. Is there would be no John Connor if they didn't send the robot back and forcing John Connor to send Kyle Reese back and essentially sire him. That's what this whole thing pivots on. And it goes around in circles. So the fact that John Connor exists only means that there is a judgment day, and then the robots have to go back in time and try to stop them. And okay, I can deal with that. And we saw in Terminator Salvation, they kind of wanted to skip. They kind of wanted to get rid of that one. So Salvation is the one, if you guys don't remember, that's one where Christian Bale had the absolute meltdown on the DP. You remember that one? Why are you standing in light? I'm sure you're a nice guy, but we're through professionally. That whole thing, that was on the set of Salvation. And McG, who said that he was using this, he's the director, by the way, his name's McG, that he was using Terminator as his Bible and making all this, then why did they introduce this cyborg that Sam Worthington played? Because Salvation is supposed to be a prequel. Salvation is supposed to take place, all the events that occurred up to them sending the T-800 back and then sending Kyle Reese back. That is a prequel, but here's Sam Worthington's character, who is part human, part robot. Not cybernetic organism like the T-800 is, which is a robot with skin. Like, this dude was a person, and he's part robot. And that would have rocked the world. That would have been the something worth mentioning had you gone back in time. That they're eventually going to get to that point. But it's never mentioned because it doesn't fit with the continuity. You tried to introduce something new that was going to be earth-shattering that's supposed to take place before even the events of this film made in 1984. It didn't work. So using that as your Bible, it was great and all, but you kind of ended up screwing that, and that's why they kind of got rid of Salvation as far as the continuity goes. And then you moved into Genesis, and the greatest, I mean, it's a fairly fun movie. I think it was PG-13, so it wasn't like, T2 or Terminator. But it was a fun action film that came out amidst a swarm of action movies. So the action part, I didn't really care about. I wasn't too interested in that. What I loved in the movie was they did like shot for shot remaking of Kyle's trip back to 84, all the way up to pulling up on the cop, what day is it? What year? And then he goes into the sporting goods store and he's taking, he's taking the jacket off the rack and putting on the shoes and the boot. It was shot for shot remake until they blew all that away with, Sarah Connor coming through and, oh yeah, we sent a Terminator even farther back in time and it's raised her and she's tough and butch now. So what's the point of having Kyle Reese there? Oh yeah, they still got to do it to make John Connor. And they kind of graze over that. They do kind of introduce if we do stop Cyberdyne from occurring and do this now in somewhat the present tense, then we won't make John Connor. John Connor will cease to exist. And as much as it kind of works in with the continuity of the other movies, it is a little bit, it makes me feel a little bit down because I was raised on the first two, at least, where this is that story. And, it's the love story that spans time, and in the end, even though there is an apocalypse, that the humans do win, and the robots make their undoing on their own by creating a circumstance where they're going to necessitate John Connor being born. And as circular as that might be, it's a bit romantic. I like that. It's an underdog story, and in Genesis they try to make it another underdog story by having, the systems evolve and Connor ends up getting affected and all this other stuff. But it's just, in my mind, you can watch all of them in the Sarah Connor Chronicles and all that other fun stuff. That's fine. But in my mind, it's the first two. And T3 was absolute garbage. I remember my dad walked out. We went to go see it. And he's like, well, I'm glad they just made the first two completely unnecessary. Which, again, if you're going to have a John Connor, then Judgment Day has to happen. It has to go down. Because the robots have to be in a position where they need to send a robot back in time to kill Sarah Connor, and therefore he has to have a reason to send back Kyle Reese, and therefore make him. So it's a fun time. It's fun times. Love Terminator. Love the series. Check them out. Check them all out. Even if you're not going to particularly love a couple of them. All right, so that concludes this week's show. I've had a really fun time talking about the different aspects of time travel. I hope you have too. Please visit us on GSMCpodcast.com, where you can download not only this, but other fine programming we have as well. Follow us on Facebook and or Twitter, and you can download us on iTunes as well. I have been your host, Drew. Tune in next week where I'll be back.